Pravit Moy Druzy. Hello, my friends. I'm going to bring you a thought that I've been turning over and over and over in my head. And it's just about right, and I might miss something, but help me if I do. I'm going to argue that Putin needs Nazis. Now, that sounds very strange because part of the reason, his rationale for the invasion to begin with, was that there are these Nazis in Ukraine and we need to denazify Ukraine. Um, but Putin needs a foil. He needs a bad guy. He needs someone to oppose. And then he can be the good guy with the white hat riding to the salvation of the Russian speakers in Ukraine. So it sounds weird, but he needs to have Nazis exist in Ukraine. Now, there's no evidence that Nazis or there's some Nazi cabal over the government of Ukraine, and I've proposed that many times to Russian trolls that have come on to to watch my videos, and then they want to argue, but nobody has any evidence of it. And if you look at the major players in the Ukrainian government, I can't detect Nazis. Now, oh, but what about the Azov battalions? You know, we see these symbols of things, right? Well, yeah, but you also see that you see the Iron Cross in England, and you see other similar symbols on Russian soldiers. So I think that there are some white supremacists, some Nazis in Ukraine, but I don't know that there are many at the top or influencing the government, and I don't think that it's anything disproportionate from the rest of Europe, and it's not very different from Russia. In fact, it's arguably maybe even better than Russia, but we're not talking about Nazis in that sense. Now, there is one caveat, and that is that Nazis to Russians means something different than what it did in the 1940s in Germany. So we're not looking for guys with swastikas on their arms. They're not there. But we're not even looking for neo-Nazis, and that's part of the problem here because we're using the same term meaning different things. And I'll get back to that in a moment. To Russians, nationalists mean Nazi, and Ukrainians are very nationalistic. They want to have their own country and be apart from Russia, and they have monuments to Stephen Bandera, who did collaborate with Nazis, and that's true. But they don't revere Bandera for any time that he worked with Nazis. They revere him for supporting the idea of Ukrainian nationality, and that's a very different thing. So, and again, we always do this with our heroes. We don't revere our leaders because of the very worst thing that they did. We revere them for the best thing that they did. And same with Stephen Bandera. So we have to be fair about that. Now, they also mean Nazi in a more general term. They mean somebody who is anti-Russian or, in their terms, Russophobic. So if you take that and you expand the definition, now you're dealing with a different thing altogether. So it's almost like the definition of racism. The older definition of racism was someone doesn't like someone else because of their skin color or ethnic identity. That's racism as we've always known it. Then we have systemic racism, which is that the system is stacked against people who are in a minority status. Now, if you call racism A, racism B, or you just use the term racism to mean A or B, you have a confusing conversation with people. Now, it's okay to argue the merits of racism A or racism B. You can have that argument, but if you call it the same thing and person A is talking about racism A while person B is talking about racism B, you completely muddy the waters. And that's what we've done here with the term Nazi, because Putin is not talking about actual swastika-wearing German Nazis from the 1940s. He's talking about probably something more like nationalists or Russophobes, but he's using that term, confounding everybody who's having that conversation. Putin needs Nazis. Now, why does he need Nazis? Because if there are Nazis of some shape or form, whatever these bad guys are, if there are Nazis, then Russia is defending Russian speakers in Ukraine. And then there are the good guys on defense. Now get this, if there are no Nazis, then Russia is the aggressor. And that's what Russia can't have. They can't say, well, we're just being an aggressor. Well, what about other excuses like NATO expansion? NATO keeps expanding to the east, they'll say. Well, yeah, kind of, if you look at it one way, but kind of not if you look at it properly. They're expanding to the east. They're joining NATO and moving toward, they're not moving toward the east. The country's staying still. But these countries that were once under the thumb of the Soviet Union are now joining NATO to get away from the aggression that you're demonstrating right now in Ukraine. It's kind of like, and I've given this illustration again and again, but it's kind of like there's a big bad biker guy, and he takes this girlfriend and says, "You're my girlfriend now," and she doesn't really want to be there, but she can't really get away. So now they're out on the town, and while they're out on the town together, she sees the football team, and she runs to the arm of the biggest, baddest football player and says, "Please, I'll be your girlfriend. Please protect me." And that's kind of what these countries have done as they've joined NATO. They've run to the west to avoid being tyrannized by the east. Now, NATO is a sub-theme, and NATO is not really an issue because countries can't move. They're just making their choices based on how they've been treated by Russia. And second, Russia knows full well that countries like Ukraine that have an ongoing conflict within its borders can't actually join NATO until that conflict is resolved. So to say that you had to do this in 2022 in order to keep them from joining NATO when they've been in conflict since 2014 because Russia crossed the borders is just an outright lie. So we're back to the excuse about Nazis. And even Russian soldiers early on were told that there are Nazis in Ukraine, and they came to certain towns saying, "We're here to liberate you from the Nazis," and the people in the town were saying, "What Nazis? There are no Nazis here." And they couldn't understand it. Soldiers now are a little bit more aware than they were then, but still, they told their own soldiers that they were going to liberate the Ukrainians from Nazis. Now, there's one other motive that I think is more probable, and that is that Putin has, in the image of Peter the Great, set out to restore Russian lands, and he's used this kind of language before. Now, Ukraine is one of Russia's historical lands in Putin's eyes, and it certainly was during the Soviet era when Stalin was starving the population through the Holodomor, which is one of the factors that motivated Bandera and the nationalists. Now, if the issue is simply a land grab, then Russia's clearly the aggressor, and I think this is where we are. Now, when I was in Lithuania in 2001, I, as a souvenir, picked up this nesting doll, and this is Putin when he still had hair. So this was 22 years ago. And so if you open the nesting doll, what you find is that inside it is Yeltsin. And inside Yeltsin, we see Gorbachev. And inside Gorbachev, we see Stalin. And inside Stalin, we find Lenin. And if you go far enough with Putin, I think you'll find Peter the Great. And that's what this war is all about. It's not that there are Nazis in Ukraine. There's the spirit of Nazi, fascism, whatever you'd like to call it, Tsarism within Putin. And that's the lesson. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.